At 6:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, the German commanders in Normandy were facing a reality they had spent months preparing for, and still could not fully understand. The invasion had begun. American soldiers were coming ashore on Utah and Omaha beaches. British and Canadian troops were landing farther east. Thousands of Allied paratroopers were already scattered behind German lines. Above them, the sky was filled with aircraft. Off the coast, an armada stretched across the English Channel. And somewhere inside the German command structure, a question was becoming impossible to ignore. Was this the invasion? Or was it only the beginning of a much larger deception? That uncertainty would become one of the most important advantages the Americans and their allies possessed on D-Day. The German High Command had known for months that an Allied invasion was coming. They had built bunkers, mined beaches, placed artillery along the coast, and moved armored divisions into France. But knowing an invasion was coming was not the same as knowing where it would come. The Germans had been deliberately fed a false story. The Allies wanted Berlin to believe that the main invasion would strike the Pas de Calais, the narrowest crossing between Britain and France. The deception was so elaborate that German intelligence continued to believe a major Allied force was waiting under General George Patton, ready to attack Calais. The real invasion was happening in Normandy. And when the first reports began arriving on German headquarters telephones and radios, some commanders hesitated. Others reacted immediately. But almost all faced the same problem. They did not know whether Normandy was the main blow. U.S. Army Center of Military History. Rommel wasn't there. One of the most famous German commanders of the Second World War was not even in Normandy when the invasion began. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was away in Germany. He had traveled home to celebrate his wife's birthday. It was an extraordinary coincidence. Rommel had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. He had inspected coastal defenses personally. He had ordered mines laid. He had demanded obstacles be placed in the water. He had pushed engineers to build stronger defensive positions. He understood something that many German officers did not. If the Allies landed successfully, Allied air power could make movement almost impossible. German tanks moving during daylight could be attacked from the sky. German supply columns could be destroyed. Roads and bridges could be bombed. Reinforcements could be delayed. And Allied naval guns could support the troops almost directly from the sea. Rommel therefore believed the invasion had to be stopped immediately. Not miles inland. Not after the Allies established a bridgehead. At the beaches. His basic fear was brutally simple. If the Americans and British could get enough men and equipment ashore, Germany might not be able to drive them back. The American landing at Omaha would prove just how close that possibility came to disaster. But Rommel was not there to see the first reports arrive. His headquarters had to respond without him. And the man standing above much of the German defense structure was Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. Rundstedt's dilemma. Rundstedt was an experienced soldier. He was older than Rommel and represented a very different military philosophy. He believed German armored reserves should remain mobile. If the Allies landed somewhere along the coast, the German army could identify the main attack and then bring powerful armored forces against it. In theory this made sense, but there was a problem. The Allies controlled the skies. Rundstedt's armored divisions would have to move through a battlefield dominated by Allied aircraft. And that meant every mile of movement could become a fight for survival. Rommel understood this. Rundstedt understood the danger too. But the two commanders disagreed about where German tanks should wait. Rommel wanted them close to the beaches. Rundstedt preferred a concentrated armored reserve farther inland. Hitler ultimately compromised. Some armored divisions were placed under Rommel's authority. Others remained under higher command. The result was neither strategy in its pure form. It was a divided command. And on the morning of June 6th, that division would become painfully important. The first reports. Before dawn, German communications began filling with reports. Paratroopers, aircraft, naval activity, ships, explosions, gliders, flares, gunfire. The scale was enormous. But German commanders did not immediately have a complete picture. The invasion was happening across a huge area. Allied airborne troops had deliberately been scattered across the battlefield. Some units landed miles from their intended locations. This created confusion among the Germans, but it also created confusion among the Allies. American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were fighting isolated battles in Normandy. Some landed in fields. Some landed in villages. Some landed in flooded areas. Some were separated from their units. Yet the Germans could not simply dismiss the reports. Something enormous was happening. The question was what it meant. Was Normandy the main invasion? Or was Normandy a diversion? The answer was critical. Because if Normandy was a deception, the German 15th Army around Calais had to remain in position. And if the Germans kept those divisions waiting for an attack that never came, the forces needed in Normandy would remain trapped hundreds of miles away. That was exactly what Allied deception planners wanted. The German commanders hear the gunfire. 4 German soldiers near the beaches, there was no ambiguity. They could see the invasion. They could hear it. The sea was filled with landing craft. Warships were firing. Aircraft were overhead. The horizon seemed to have disappeared behind smoke. On Omaha Beach, American troops were entering one of the most violent killing zones of the entire invasion. German defenders occupied fortified positions overlooking the beach. Machine guns fired down toward the water. Mortars and artillery added to the chaos. American landing craft were hit. Men were thrown into the sea. Some drowned beneath the weight of their equipment. Others struggled toward the beach under fire. From the German perspective, the Americans were coming directly into the defensive system. Yet the German commanders still faced a strategic problem. The beach fighting alone did not tell them whether Normandy was the decisive invasion. The Allied deception campaign had created a psychological trap. The Germans had been trained to expect another major attack. The Pas-de-Calais remained a possibility. And as long as German commanders believed Patton's supposed army might still attack there, they had to keep major forces in place. That hesitation would cost Germany precious hours. Rommel's warning. Before D-Day, Rommel had repeatedly emphasized the importance of the first day. One commonly cited account summarizes his position in stark terms. The invasion had to be stopped on the first day. If the Allies were not stopped at the beaches, the situation could become almost impossible to reverse. The exact wording of statements attributed to Rommel varies across later accounts, so historians have to be careful about treating every dramatic quotation as a verbatim battlefield statement. But his strategic position is clear. Rommel believed the first 24 hours could decide the campaign, and the logic was powerful. The Allies were not simply landing infantry. They were bringing an industrial system across the English Channel. Behind the first waves came vehicles, artillery, engineers, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, communications equipment, tanks, more infantry, more artillery, more supplies. The longer the Americans and British remained on French soil, the stronger their position would become. The Germans therefore needed to destroy the beachhead before it became an army. That was the race unfolding on June 6th. The most important question: where were the Panzers? For German commanders, the most important question after the first reports was not simply how many Americans had landed. It was this: where were the tanks? German armored divisions were the potential hammer. If enough German tanks could reach the beaches quickly, they might counterattack before the American infantry could consolidate. But the German armored reserves were not controlled by a single commander with complete freedom. Some were under Army Group B. Others were part of Panzer Group West. And critical armored formations required authorization from higher command. Ultimately, Hitler retained control over important reserves. This created a dangerous delay. In a battle where hours mattered, German commanders sometimes had to ask Berlin for permission to move formations. The Allied command structure was not perfect, but it was generally far more capable of moving forces rapidly toward Normandy. The German command structure was tangled by competing authorities: Army, Air Force, Navy, KW, Army Group B, OB West, and Hitler himself. Every layer could slow a decision. And D-Day was a battle in which a slow decision could become a fatal decision. Hitler is still asleep. Perhaps the most famous detail of the morning is also one of the most misunderstood. Adolf Hitler was asleep at his headquarters when the invasion began. The significance was not simply that the German dictator was sleeping. It was that the command system depended heavily on him. Several critical panzer divisions were held in reserve. Their release required authorization. And as reports came in, the Germans still did not know whether Normandy was the main invasion. Hitler's staff therefore hesitated. The possibility of a deception remained alive. If the Germans moved their reserves south toward Normandy and the real invasion came at Calais, they could lose their chance to defend the decisive point. The Allies had created exactly this dilemma, and now the Germans were trapped inside it. For the Americans on the beaches, this meant something extraordinary. Every hour that German armor did not arrive was an hour the beachhead could grow stronger. The American soldiers on Omaha. While generals argued over maps, American soldiers were fighting for yards. Omaha Beach was supposed to be one of the key American landing areas. Instead, it became a nightmare. The landing craft approached the beach. Ramps dropped. Men jumped into deep water. Some were immediately killed. Others struggled forward. The beach was exposed. German positions had survived enough of the Allied bombardment to continue firing. American units became disorganized. Officers were killed. Radios were lost. Units mixed together. Some soldiers abandoned heavy equipment simply to survive. But slowly, painfully, the Americans began moving. Small groups climbed bluffs. Engineers opened paths through obstacles. Infantry attacked German defensive positions. The American landing did not succeed because everything went according to plan. It succeeded because individuals and small units continued fighting after the plan had broken down. From the German perspective, this was equally important. The defenders were not facing a force that collapsed under heavy casualties. They were facing soldiers who kept coming. Utah Beach, a different story. Farther west, Utah Beach presented a different picture. The American 4th Infantry Division landed there and encountered comparatively lighter resistance. One of the most famous moments came when Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. discovered that his troops had landed in the wrong location. His response was essentially to accept the situation. The troops would move forward from where they were. It became one of the most famous examples of battlefield adaptation during D-Day. The American landing at Utah did not unfold exactly as planners intended, but the troops established themselves. They connected with airborne forces. They pushed inland, and the beachhead began expanding. This was the nightmare Rommel had feared. The Allies were no longer merely touching French soil. They were beginning to occupy it. The Germans realized this is big. As the morning continued, German commanders received more reports. The scale of the Allied operation was becoming impossible to ignore. But uncertainty remained. Some German leaders still believed Normandy might be a diversion. The 15th Army around Calais remained on alert. This was one of the great successes of Operation Fortitude. The Allies had created a fictional army group. It appeared to be commanded by General George Patton. Fake radio traffic supported the deception. Inflatable tanks and dummy equipment helped create the impression of a massive invasion force in southeastern England. German reconnaissance and intelligence were repeatedly encouraged to believe that Calais remained the most likely target. The deception did not need to convince every German officer. It only needed to delay the right German divisions. And it did. Rommel returns to the battle. Rommel eventually learned what had happened. He returned toward his headquarters as the invasion unfolded. But by the time he could fully assess the situation, the Allies had already established themselves. The question was no longer whether Germany could prevent an invasion. The invasion had happened. The question was whether Germany could destroy the beachhead. Rommel's greatest fear was now becoming reality. The Allied air forces were dominating the battlefield. German movement was becoming dangerous. The Allied Navy was supporting the ground troops. And American reinforcements continued arriving. The German response required speed. But speed was exactly what the German command structure was struggling to produce. Rundstedt seized the problem. Rundstedt's position was becoming increasingly difficult. He had long understood that the Allies possessed overwhelming material superiority. Germany could not match the American ability to produce vehicles, ammunition, aircraft, ships, and replacements. The German army could still fight extremely effectively. But it could not afford an unlimited battle of attrition. The invasion therefore had to be contained. The Germans needed to prevent the Allied beachhead from expanding. They needed to counterattack. They needed reserves. And above all, they needed time. But time was now working against them. Every hour brought more Allied soldiers onto French soil. Every hour brought more equipment. Every hour brought more aircraft. Every hour made the Allied position harder to destroy. The battle for the decision. Imagine the German command map on June 6th. At one location, American forces are fighting through Omaha. At another, American forces are moving inland from Utah. British and Canadian troops are pushing inland farther east. Airborne troops are disrupting German communications. German reserves are moving, or waiting for orders. And somewhere behind the lines, officers are asking the same question again. Is this the main invasion? The answer should have been obvious. But the Allied deception had made certainty difficult. That uncertainty was not an accident. It had been manufactured over months. It involved fake units, fake radio signals, double agents, dummy equipment, controlled intelligence leaks, and carefully constructed misinformation. The Germans were fighting not only an army, they were fighting a story. and they could not immediately determine which parts of the story were real. The German 15th Army. The 15th Army was one of the most important German forces in northern France. Its troops were positioned to defend against an Allied attack toward Calais. Even after Normandy was clearly under attack, German commanders remained concerned about a second landing. That concern tied down forces that could have been useful in Normandy. This was one of the strategic consequences of fortitude. The Allies did not have to destroy every German unit. They simply had to prevent some of those units from arriving where they were needed. A German division sitting near Calais was not directly fighting American soldiers on Omaha Beach, but its existence affected the battle. Its commanders had to remain prepared. Its troops could not simply disappear. Its vehicles could not be moved without orders. And the longer the Germans waited for a non-existent invasion at Calais, the more powerful the real invasion in Normandy became. The Panther and the Sherman. Eventually, German armor did begin moving toward Normandy. Some of the most famous German tanks of the war entered the battle. Panthers, Panzer IVs, Tiger tanks. They were formidable machines. American troops respected their firepower. But tanks do not fight alone. They require fuel, ammunition, maintenance, communications, infantry, artillery, and freedom of movement. The Germans increasingly lacked all of these advantages. The Allies had overwhelming air superiority. American fighter bombers attacked roads, bridges, railways, vehicles, troop concentrations. Anything that moved during daylight could potentially be attacked. The German army could still launch devastating local counterattacks, but sustaining those attacks became increasingly difficult. Rommel had warned about this before the invasion. Now the battlefield was proving him right. The first night. By the evening of June 6th, the Germans had not thrown the Allies back into the sea. That fact alone was enormous. The Allies had suffered thousands of casualties. The beaches were covered with destroyed vehicles and equipment. Some units were still struggling to connect with their objectives. But the invasion force remained. More importantly, the Germans had failed to destroy it. The first day had not gone according to Allied plans. But it had gone well enough. The beachheads existed. That meant the German problem was becoming larger. The Americans were no longer simply landing. They were building a logistical base. Supplies were arriving. Medical units were operating. Artillery was moving inland. Engineers were clearing obstacles. Command posts were being established. The invasion was becoming permanent. What did the German generals really think? This is where the popular story of D-Day becomes more complicated. There is a temptation to imagine German generals standing around a map and delivering dramatic one-line declarations. History is rarely that clean. The German commanders did not all react in the same way. They had different personalities, different responsibilities, different information, and different opinions about how the invasion should be defeated. Rommel believed the invasion had to be stopped at the shoreline. Rundstedt had favored a mobile armored reserve. General Leo Gere von Schweppenberg commanded Panzer Group West and supported a more mobile armored approach. Other officers understood that Allied air superiority had fundamentally changed the conditions of modern maneuver warfare. The German commanders were not ignorant. They understood the danger. Their problem was that the German military system could not always turn that understanding into action. Rommel's strategic fear. Rommel's concern was not simply that American soldiers would land. It was what would happen afterward. Imagine a German tank division trying to move toward Normandy. It has to travel along roads. But Allied bombers have damaged bridges. Fighter bombers patrol the skies. Vehicles must move through villages. Rail lines have been destroyed. Fuel deliveries are threatened. The closer the division gets to the beachhead, the more likely it is to encounter artillery and air attacks. This was a completely different battlefield from the one German armored forces had dominated earlier in the war. In Poland and France in 1939 and 1940, German formations had exploited mobility and coordination. In Normandy, Allied air power restricted German mobility. Rommel understood that. His solution was to bring the tanks closer to the coast. If the invasion could be smashed before Allied air power and logistics became overwhelming, Germany might still win. But if the Americans established a deep bridgehead, the strategic balance would become almost impossible to reverse. Rundstedt's calculation. Rundstedt saw the same problem from another direction. He believed that a landing was inevitable. The Germans could not build an equally powerful defense at every possible beach. The coast was too long. Resources were too limited. So instead, the German army needed reserves that could move to the actual invasion point. That required concentration. It required mobility. and it required keeping armored forces away from the immediate coastal bombardment. The theory was logical, but Allied air power made the movement of those reserves extremely dangerous. The German commanders were therefore caught between two imperfect strategies: keep the tanks near the coast and risk losing them to Allied naval and air fire, or keep them inland and risk arriving too late. The invasion exposed the strategic disagreement in the most brutal possible way: Hitler's compromise. Hitler's compromise satisfied neither side completely. 3 armored divisions were placed under Rommel. 4 others remained in a central reserve under higher authority. This division of control was supposed to balance competing strategies. Instead, it complicated decision-making. When the invasion came, some German armor could respond, but not all of it could respond immediately, and every delay mattered. The Germans had one opportunity to destroy the Allied bridgehead before it became too strong. That opportunity was disappearing hour by hour: the Allied Armada. From the German perspective, perhaps the most terrifying sight was not the first landing craft. It was the scale of what followed. The invasion fleet was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of men would eventually pass through Normandy. Ships delivered supplies. Landing craft carried vehicles. Artificial harbors would support the invasion. Engineers repaired roads. American logistics began transforming the beachhead. This was America's industrial power appearing on a battlefield thousands of miles from home. The German army was now fighting a country that could replace destroyed vehicles and ammunition on a scale Germany could not match. The first German commanders to understand this did not necessarily need to see the future. They could see the present. The Allied army was growing, and the German army was struggling to stop it. The second day, on June 7th, the battle changed. The invasion was no longer a surprise. German forces knew where the main Allied bridgehead was. The question was whether they could counterattack successfully. American troops began moving inland. They fought through villages. They encountered German strongpoints. They faced snipers, mortars, machine guns, armored vehicles, artillery. The German army remained dangerous, but the Americans were now supported by an enormous logistical system, and the beachhead continued to expand. The German commander's worst-case scenario was happening. The Allies had survived the first day. Now they were reinforcing. The German counterattack. German counterattacks could be fierce. In some places, German troops pushed Allied units back. Armored formations struck American positions. German artillery caused heavy casualties. But local success was not enough. The Germans needed a decisive operational victory. They needed to destroy the Allied bridgehead, and they needed to do it before Allied reinforcements became overwhelming. That victory never came. Instead, the Allies gradually linked their landing areas. The American beaches became connected to the larger Allied front. The invasion began turning into a campaign. And once that happened, the German position became increasingly difficult. The failure of the Atlantic Wall. The Atlantic Wall had been presented by German propaganda as an enormous defensive system, and in places it was formidable. But it was never a continuous concrete wall stretching perfectly from Norway to Spain. Defenses varied dramatically. Some areas had massive bunkers. Others had incomplete positions. Some coastal sectors were defended by experienced troops. Others were held by lower quality formations. The Germans simply did not have enough resources to fortify every possible landing point equally. Rommel had tried to improve the defenses. He had ordered obstacles and mines. But even he knew the system was incomplete. When the Americans arrived, the Atlantic Wall could inflict terrible casualties. It could slow the invasion. It could turn beaches into killing grounds. But it could not stop the full weight of the Allied invasion. The view from Berlin. Far away from Normandy, German leaders were trying to understand what was happening. Reports arrived. Then more reports. Then conflicting reports. Hitler and his staff had to decide whether the invasion was the main attack. 4 hours, the possibility of a second landing at Calais remained important. This was exactly the situation Allied planners had wanted. The Germans were not completely fooled. They were delayed. And delay was enough. By the time German leaders accepted that Normandy was the decisive invasion, the Allies had already landed a huge force. The strategic window for destroying the invasion was closing. The American soldier becomes the decisive factor. There is another part of D-Day that German generals could not control: the determination of the American soldier. At Omaha, American troops had suffered enormous casualties. The original plan had been disrupted. Command structures had broken down. Communication was unreliable. Yet soldiers continued moving forward. At Utah, the landing went more smoothly. Airborne units continued fighting behind the German lines. Rangers climbed cliffs at Point du Hoc. Engineers cleared obstacles. Medics treated wounded men under fire. Officers improvised. Sergeants took command when officers fell. Privates carried ammunition. Tank crews fought their way inland. The German generals had spent months preparing for an invasion, but they were discovering that preparation could not predict everything a determined enemy would do. The moment the Germans lost the beaches, the decisive moment was not necessarily a single explosion. It was cumulative. One American unit reached the seawall. Another climbed a ridge. Another cleared a road. Another captured a German position. Another linked with airborne troops. Another brought artillery ashore. Another landed supplies. Each success made the next success easier. The German defensive system was designed to break the invasion at the water. Instead, the Americans slowly broke through it. Once troops moved beyond the beach defenses, German positions that had been designed to fire toward the sea became less useful. The battlefield moved inland. And inland, the Allies possessed advantages that grew stronger with every mile. Air power, artillery, armor, communications, supplies, replacements, and overwhelming logistical capacity. The generals begin to see the future. The German commanders now faced a grim calculation. Even if they could contain the Americans temporarily, what would happen when more divisions arrived? The Allies had not committed everything. The invasion force was still growing. Germany was already fighting the Soviet Union in the east. The Mediterranean remained an active theater. German industry was under enormous bombing pressure. Fuel was increasingly scarce. And now an American-led army was opening a massive front in Western Europe. The German generals understood that the invasion was not an isolated battle. It was the beginning of the endgame. The question was how long Germany could resist. Rommel's private assessment. Rommel's later assessments became increasingly pessimistic. He understood the impact of Allied air power. He saw German formations being destroyed or delayed while moving toward the front. He understood the importance of the growing Allied bridgehead. And he increasingly believed that Germany needed to find a political solution before military defeat became unavoidable. But there was a difference between understanding that a war was becoming unwinnable and being willing to act against Hitler. Rommel's position became more complicated as the summer progressed. He would eventually become associated with opposition circles within Germany. But those events occurred after D-Day. On June 6 itself, his primary concern was military. Stop the invasion. Destroy the bridgehead. Prevent the Allies from breaking out. That mission was already becoming extraordinarily difficult. The cost of delay. Every military operation depends on time. The Germans needed time to identify the invasion, time to release reserves, time to move tanks, time to organize counterattacks, time to bring infantry forward, time to establish artillery concentrations. But the Allies needed only enough time to build their bridgehead. That difference mattered. German delays helped the Americans. American persistence created more delays for the Germans. The result became a feedback loop. The stronger the American beachhead became, the harder it was for German forces to destroy it. The harder it became to destroy, the more reinforcements arrived. And the more reinforcements arrived, the stronger the beachhead became. By the end of the first week, the invasion was no longer a gamble. It was a reality. The battle becomes a war of material. German soldiers could still fight. German officers could still plan. German tanks could still destroy American vehicles. German artillery could still kill Allied infantry. But Germany was entering a war of material that it was increasingly unable to win. American factories were producing enormous quantities of weapons. American ships crossed the Atlantic. American aircraft dominated the skies. American soldiers were supplied with ammunition, food, fuel, radios, vehicles, and medical support. The German army could not simply destroy the first wave and expect the invasion to disappear. There were too many waves. Too many ships, too many aircraft, too many divisions, too much industrial capacity behind them. The Germans had to defeat not just the soldiers on the beach. They had to defeat the entire Allied logistical machine. And that was almost impossible. What Rundstedt would later say. Rundstedt's later testimony provides an important window into the thinking of the German High Command. After the war, he acknowledged that he and Rommel had attempted to persuade Hitler to alter the conduct of the war and withdraw the front. That testimony came after the invasion and after Germany's military situation had deteriorated further. It should therefore not be confused with a literal statement made on the morning of June 6. But it reveals something important. The German commanders increasingly understood that military reality was moving beyond Hitler's political expectations. The front was becoming unsustainable. The war was turning against Germany, and the generals could see it. Rommel confronts Hitler. Later in July 1944, Rommel and Rundstedt would meet Hitler and describe the seriousness of the situation in France. General Alfred Jodl later recalled that Rommel spoke clearly about the tremendous superiority of Allied air power and the helplessness of German ground operations against it. According to Jodl's post-war testimony, Rommel eventually asked Hitler what he believed about the future development of the war. Hitler responded angrily and dismissed the question. This exchange occurred weeks after D-Day. But it helps us understand what the German commanders had learned from the invasion. The problem was no longer theoretical. The Allies had demonstrated their ability to land. They had survived the first day. They had established a bridgehead. And now German forces were being forced backward. The American advantage grows. The Americans did not win Normandy simply because the Germans made mistakes. That would be an incomplete explanation. The Germans made serious mistakes. But the Allied victory also reflected enormous preparation. American troops had trained for months. The Navy had prepared the invasion fleet. Army engineers had studied beaches and tides. Air forces had attacked German transportation networks. Intelligence officers had worked on deception. British and American planners had developed an enormous logistical system. The invasion was the product of years of preparation. On June 6th, all of those preparations came together. The German generals were therefore facing an enemy that had not simply arrived. The Americans had built an entire war machine for this moment. The sound of the beaches. Imagine the sound. Aircraft overhead. Naval guns offshore. Machine guns from bunkers. Mortars exploding in the sand. Men shouting. Landing craft engines. Tank engines. Artillery. Radio messages. Orders. Screams. The crash of metal. The sound of waves. And above it all, thousands of aircraft. For German commanders, the battlefield had become enormous. For the American soldier, it was intensely personal. A few hundred yards of sand. A bunker. A road. A hedge. A hill. A field. A village. The generals were thinking about France. The soldiers were thinking about surviving the next minute. Why the Germans could not simply push the Americans back? The obvious question is this. If the Germans knew where the Americans had landed, why didn't they simply attack in overwhelming strength? The answer lies in the structure of the battle. The Allies controlled the sea. They controlled the air. They had enormous reserves. And the German armored formations were scattered and constrained by command decisions. German movements were vulnerable to Allied aircraft. Railways had been damaged. Roads were attacked. Bridges were destroyed. The Germans could concentrate forces locally. But concentrating enough force for a decisive counterattack was extremely difficult. And even when German forces attacked, Allied artillery and aircraft could respond. The invasion was therefore protected by layers. First the fleet, then naval gunfire, then aircraft, then artillery, then armor, then infantry, then logistics. The Germans had to break through all of those layers. They never did. The biggest misunderstanding of D-Day. The biggest misunderstanding about D-Day is that victory was guaranteed. It wasn't. Eisenhower himself understood the risk. Before the invasion, he prepared a message accepting responsibility if the operation failed. The Allies knew the consequences of failure could be catastrophic. But German commanders also knew that the invasion represented an extraordinary gamble. If they could destroy the beachhead quickly, the Allies could suffer a major strategic defeat. The German opportunity was real. It simply did not last long. The first day was therefore not the end of the battle. It was the moment when the Germans failed to win the battle that mattered most. The American breakthrough. After the initial landings, the Americans faced another challenge. Normandy was not open country. It was bocage country. Hedges, sunken roads, narrow lanes, fields enclosed by thick earthen banks. Every hedge could conceal German soldiers. Every road could become an ambush. The Americans would eventually have to fight through this terrain at enormous cost. So even after D-Day succeeded, victory was not immediate. But the crucial fact remained. The Allies were in France. The German generals had failed to prevent the establishment of a permanent bridgehead. And now the battle was moving toward a larger confrontation. The German command structure begins to break. The invasion exposed problems that had existed before June 6th. German command was fragmented. Hitler interfered directly. Different branches of the armed forces operated under different chains of command. Some armored forces were withheld. Some commanders disagreed about strategy. The result was a system that could still produce tactical brilliance but struggled to coordinate a large-scale response. The American command structure had its own problems, but the Allied system was designed around cooperation. Army, Navy, Air Force, British, American, Canadian, and forces from other Allied nations. The invasion succeeded because these different components could support one another. The German system was increasingly unable to do the same. The generals had been right about one thing. The German commanders had correctly understood that the invasion would be enormous. They had correctly understood that Allied air superiority mattered. They had correctly understood that the beaches were critical. They had correctly understood that the armored reserves would determine whether the invasion could be defeated. But understanding the problem was not enough. The Germans lacked the ability to execute the solution under the conditions the Allies had created. That is one of the most important lessons of D-Day. A military plan does not exist in isolation. It exists inside an environment. And the Allies had changed that environment before the first landing craft touched the beach. The deception that fought the battle before the battle. Fortitude may have been one of the most important weapons used during D-Day. There were no bullets in it, no artillery shells, no tanks, but it attacked the German decision-making process. The Allies wanted German commanders to believe that the main invasion would come at Calais, so they created an army that did not exist. They placed General Patton at its head. They generated radio traffic. They used dummy tanks. They encouraged German intelligence to believe the story. And when the real invasion came, the deception continued doing its job. German forces near Calais remained relevant. The Germans could not afford to assume the threat was fake. The Allies had therefore created a battlefield where German commanders could not confidently identify the decisive point. That uncertainty helped win time. And on June 6th, time was priceless. The first 24 hours. Rommel's belief in the importance of the first day now becomes clearer. The Germans did not need to defeat every American soldier. They needed to prevent the Allies from establishing a sustainable foothold. They failed. At the end of June 6th, American forces remained on French soil. They had captured positions. They had opened routes. They had begun bringing equipment ashore. And they had demonstrated something Germany desperately wanted to prevent. The English Channel could no longer protect Western Europe from an Allied army. The Atlantic Wall had been penetrated. The German soldiers' view. For ordinary German soldiers, the strategic picture was much less clear. Many did not know what Hitler knew. They did not know what Rundstedt knew. They did not know what Rommel knew. They knew only what was in front of them. American soldiers, aircraft, artillery, ships, tanks. The German soldier could still fight effectively. Some German units fought with extraordinary determination, but determination could not erase the imbalance. The Americans could replace losses. They could bring new divisions. They could bring new artillery. They could bring fuel. The Germans increasingly could not. The end of the beachhead question. By the middle of June, one question had effectively disappeared. The Allies were not going back into the sea. The Germans now had to deal with a new reality. Normandy was an Allied base. Cherbourg would become a major objective. American forces would push west and south. British and Canadian forces would continue fighting toward Cannes. The German army would attempt to contain the invasion. But the strategic initiative was now in Allied hands. That was perhaps the greatest thing the German generals realized after D-Day. The Germans were no longer deciding where the war would happen. The Allies were. What did they say afterward? There was no single German statement that captures the reaction to D-Day. There was no universally documented moment when every German general suddenly announced that the war was lost. The reality was more gradual. Some commanders believed the invasion could still be defeated. Others became increasingly pessimistic. Rommel understood the danger almost immediately. Rundstedt understood the scale of the Allied material advantage. Gerd von Schweppenberg understood the difficulty of armored movement under Allied air superiority. And as the campaign continued, German commanders increasingly described the situation in France as catastrophic. Later testimony from German leaders confirms that they understood how serious the Allied air advantage had become. But the key point is not one dramatic sentence. It is what their decisions reveal. They knew they had to stop the invasion. They failed. They knew they needed armored reserves. Those reserves were delayed, divided, or exposed. They knew Allied air power would make movement difficult. It did. They knew the beachhead had to be destroyed quickly. It wasn't. And once the invasion survived the first day, The strategic balance began moving decisively toward the Allies. The American landing becomes an American army. There is a moment in every invasion when soldiers stop being invaders and become an army. D-Day began with men coming ashore. It continued with an army building itself. Artillery arrived. Tanks arrived. Engineers arrived. Fuel arrived. Ammunition arrived. Medical supplies arrived. Headquarters arrived. Airfields were prepared. Roads were improved. Communications expanded. The temporary beachhead became permanent. That transformation was exactly what Rommel had feared. Once the Americans could sustain large formations in France, the Germans were no longer fighting to prevent an invasion. They were fighting an Allied army on the European continent. The shadow of Patton. Even after D-Day, the German fear of General George Patton continued to influence their thinking. Patton had become one of the most respected American commanders in German intelligence assessments. The Allies used that reputation against them. The fictional 1st U.S. Army Group under Patton remained part of the deception. German commanders continued worrying about Calais. That meant Normandy could receive time to grow. This is one of the strangest elements of D-Day. One of America's most famous generals helped convince the Germans that he was somewhere he wasn't. The imaginary army had a real effect. It tied down real German soldiers. The road to the Falaise pocket. The fighting after D-Day would eventually lead to one of the most devastating German defeats in Normandy. The Allies broke out from the beachhead. American forces moved through the peninsula and toward the south. British and Canadian forces applied pressure from the east. German forces increasingly became trapped between converging Allied armies. By August, the German position in Normandy was collapsing. The Falaise pocket became a symbol of that collapse. Thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured. Large amounts of equipment were abandoned. The German army had failed to stop the invasion. Now it was retreating across France. But that outcome had roots in the first 24 hours. The German commanders had been given a chance to destroy the invasion. They had not succeeded. The price of the Allied victory. The American victory at Normandy came at a terrible price. Thousands of American soldiers were killed or wounded during the landings and subsequent fighting. British and Canadian forces suffered heavy losses. German forces suffered enormous casualties as well. The landscape of Normandy became a battlefield for weeks. Villages were destroyed. Fields were scarred. Families were caught between armies. The liberation of Western Europe was not clean. It was violent. It was costly. And it was uncertain. The soldiers on those beaches did not know how the campaign would end. They only knew they had to move forward. The moment Germany lost the initiative, the invasion did not instantly destroy Nazi Germany. Germany would continue fighting for almost another year. The war in the East remained enormous. The Battle of the Bulge would come. German forces would launch counterattacks. American soldiers would continue fighting across France, Belgium, and Germany. So D-Day was not the final battle, but it was a turning point. Before June 6th, Germany still controlled most of Western Europe. After June 6th, Germany was fighting to hold it. Before D-Day, Hitler could concentrate enormous attention on the Eastern Front. After D-Day, Germany had to fight a major land war against the Americans, British, Canadians, and their allies in the West. The strategic situation had changed forever. The generals could see the difference. For German commanders, the invasion revealed something that had become increasingly difficult to deny. Germany could still win battles. But winning individual battles was no longer enough. The Allies could absorb losses. They could replace equipment. They could expand their forces. They could control the sea. They could dominate the air. And they could bring American industrial power directly onto the European battlefield. The German army was now fighting an enemy with deeper reserves and greater resources. The generals understood this. Some accepted it reluctantly. Some continued hoping for a decisive counterattack. Some began considering the political consequences of continued war. But all were operating inside a strategic situation that was becoming worse by the day. The most important word, too late. The story of German reaction to D-Day can almost be reduced to two words. Too late. Too late to identify the main landing immediately. Too late to release all armored reserves. Too late to destroy the beachhead. Too late to prevent American reinforcements. Too late to stop Allied air power from dominating the battlefield. And eventually, too late to save German forces in France. This does not mean the German army was weak. It was not. German forces would fight fiercely throughout Normandy. But the strategic problem had become larger than battlefield courage. The Germans had lost the race against time. The last chance. There was a brief period when German commanders still had a realistic opportunity to make the invasion much more costly. If the Allied beachheads had remained isolated, if German armor had arrived faster, if the deception had failed, if Allied naval support had been neutralized, if German aircraft had been able to challenge Allied air superiority, if the German command structure had responded more rapidly, the result could have been very different. But history is not built from possibilities. It is built from decisions. And on June 6, 1944, the German command system made enough delays and miscalculations to allow the Americans and their allies to survive the most dangerous hours. Once that happened, the balance shifted. The view from the German headquarters. Picture the map again. Small markings representing American units are spreading inland. German defensive lines are bending. Reports are arriving from different sectors. The beachheads are expanding. The number of Allied troops is increasing. German commanders are requesting reinforcements. Some are being released. Others are waiting. The 15th Army remains concerned about Calais. The Allied air forces continue striking roads. The Navy continues firing. The Americans continue landing. And somewhere on that map, a German officer understands what Rommel had feared. The invasion has survived. The Allies have established their foothold. Now Germany must fight them in France. The words that mattered most. Perhaps the most revealing German statements after D-Day were not dramatic quotations at all. They were warnings, assessments, requests, reports, arguments. Rommel's insistence that the invasion had to be stopped immediately. Rundstedt's concerns about how to use the armored reserves. German reports describing the scale of the Allied landing. Later assessments describing the overwhelming power of Allied air forces. These were the words of professional soldiers attempting to understand a battlefield that had changed faster than their command system could respond. The American answer. The American answer to the German defenses was not a single weapon. It was combined power. Infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, air power, naval gunfire, logistics, intelligence, and leadership. The invasion worked because all of these systems operated together. An American infantryman could call for artillery. An artillery unit could receive coordinates. Aircraft could attack German positions. Engineers could clear obstacles. Ships could provide fire support. Supply units could bring ammunition forward. The Germans faced a system, not simply an army. And that system kept growing. Why the German generals couldn't stop it? The final answer is therefore more complicated than saying German generals underestimated America. They did not. Many German officers respected American military power. They knew American production was enormous. They knew Allied air superiority was dangerous. They knew the invasion would be massive. But they were fighting under political and organizational restrictions. Hitler controlled critical decisions. German reserves were divided. The deception campaign distorted intelligence. Allied air power restricted movement. And the geography of Normandy favored a defender only temporarily. Once the Americans broke through the coastal defenses, the entire strategic problem changed. The German generals were trying to stop an army that was becoming stronger every hour. The legacy of June 6th. More than 80 years later, D-Day remains one of the defining military operations in American history. It is remembered for the beaches, for the landing craft, for the paratroopers, for the Rangers, for the battleships offshore, for the soldiers who walked into machine gun fire. But there is another story. It is the story of what happened inside German headquarters. The invasion was expected, yet its location was misunderstood. The defenses were prepared, yet they were incomplete. The armored reserves existed, yet they were divided. The German commanders understood the danger, yet their response was delayed. The Americans suffered enormous casualties, yet they stayed. And that was the decisive fact. The beachhead survived. At the end of June 6, 1944, the question was no longer whether American troops had landed. They had. The question was whether they could stay. They did. The next day brought more troops. Then more. Then more. The temporary invasion became a permanent front. The German generals had failed at the exact moment when success mattered most. The Allies had survived the first day. And now the full power of America was coming ashore. The final realization. For the German commanders, the realization was probably less cinematic than history sometimes makes it appear. There was no single moment when everyone stopped and declared the war finished. Instead, the evidence accumulated. More Allied ships, more Allied aircraft, more American troops, more tanks, more artillery, more supplies, more territory, more German losses, more damaged railways, more destroyed vehicles, more delays. The numbers told the story. The invasion was becoming too large to destroy. And once the German generals understood that, the battle had entered a new phase. The last word, the most important thing the German generals learned after the American landings on D-Day was not simply that American soldiers were brave. It was that America had arrived in Europe with the ability to sustain a war on a scale Germany could not match. The Germans had prepared for an invasion. The Americans had prepared for a campaign. The Germans had built defenses. The Americans brought engineers to break them. The Germans had tanks. The Americans brought air power to restrict them. The Germans had artillery. The Americans brought naval guns and their own artillery. The Germans had experienced commanders. The Americans had an enormous coalition behind them. And most importantly, once the first American soldiers reached the beaches, the Germans could not make them leave. That was the moment the war in Western Europe changed. Not when Paris was liberated. Not when American troops crossed into Germany. Not when Berlin fell. The turning point began on the beaches of Normandy. It began when the landing craft opened their ramps. When American soldiers stepped into the surf. When German machine guns opened fire. When the first American units reached the seawall. When airborne troops fought behind the German lines. When engineers cleared paths through the obstacles. When tanks and artillery began moving inland. And when German commanders realized that the invasion they had feared had finally arrived. Rommel had warned that the first day could decide everything. The Americans survived the first day. And because they survived it, the German generals were forced to fight a war they could no longer control. The beaches were only the beginning. The real invasion was the army that came after them. And once that army was established in France, Nazi Germany's western fortress had been broken. The German generals could still fight. They could still counterattack. They could still inflict terrible casualties. But they could no longer reverse what had happened. America had landed. And America was staying. June 6, 1944, was therefore not simply the day the Americans reached Europe. It was the day German military strategy collided with American industrial power, Allied deception, air superiority, naval strength, and the determination of soldiers who refused to stop moving forward. The German generals had spent months asking where the invasion would come. On that morning they finally had their answer: Normandy. And by the time they fully understood the answer, it was already too late. The beaches had been won. The bridgehead had survived. And the road to Germany had opened. This was D-Day. The day the Americans landed. The day the German generals realized the war in Western Europe had entered its final chapter.